You may remember last week I was talking about a particular passage from the book of Isaiah that was a favourite of John Wesley's. And in talking about it, he challenged the Methodists of his day around it. His idea that God had given us all that we need. God has given us all that we need. So if we are not producing fruit like we should, what's the problem? What's the challenge? And for John Wesley, it was around a lack of generosity from Methodists and a lack of holiness. And so I was thinking of this idea of holiness. And one of the great teachings really on how to live as God's people is the Sermon on the Mount. So our two scripture readings that we've had so far today are both preludes to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus goes through lots and lots of examples about how he calls his followers to live. And what's really at the heart of this is kind of how they live. And some of you may know that, well, I hope all of you know, that a group of us are going to Ecuador to help support their first divisional youth camp. And so we've been learning Spanish. And what we've discovered in that process is there's a certain age at which you can learn things easily and well, and whatever age that is, I passed it a long time ago. So we were talking about all sorts of grammar, about past tense and present tense and future tense. And our teacher, Richard, who is a guy who came to us really and joined in English conversation classes with us, is now teaching us Spanish. And he was talking about the future tense, and he said, sometimes you don't have to use the future tense because you just say whatever you're doing in the present tense, and then the phrase that you add to it actually tells you that it's in the future. And so you just say, I cook dinner tomorrow, all right? I cook dinner immediately after such and such, all right? So you add a phrase that tells you that's in the future. So there's actually quite a few languages that work like that don't have tenses the same way. And in English, we have these things called adverbial phrases. So adverbial phrase of manner and an adverbial phrase of time, for instance. Who knows what an adverbial phrase is? All right, Betty knows. Okay? All right? So an adverbial phrase is how you're going to do something. So remember adverbs? Is it all coming back to you? Remember adverbs were the ly words that describe verbs. So he ran quickly, all right? So the ly word quickly is the adverb. The verb is ran. You're looking a bit blank and puzzled, but I'm sure it will come back to you, all right? So the adverbial phrase of manner might be, he sings in a low register, all right? So that's a phrase that describes how he sings. So it's an adverbial phrase of manner. Now why that matters here is really what Jesus is talking about is how you do it. He's not just giving us the verbs, he's not just giving us the rules, he's saying how you do it, the heart of the thing, the motives that underpin how you live. And when you read all of the Sermon on the Mount, you need to understand that. He's talking about the manner of our righteousness, and that's the phrase that he uses, this greater righteousness. Your righteousness must be greater than the teachers of the law, he says. Now, one of the things we need to remember about holiness is it's not just negative. It's not just negation, as in I didn't or I haven't, although that is part of it. Now, when I think about the way I learnt about Christian living, and particularly being in the Salvation Army, we had some pretty long lists of things you weren't allowed to do, all right? And it kind of separated us from other Christians. You'd see a Christian group and they'd do, we don't do that, we don't do that, we don't do that. And so it can kind of seem that a negative thing is what defines us. We don't, kind of our abstinence, all right? We don't smoke, we don't gamble, we don't swear, all of those things, all right? So they were don'ts. They were abstinence. But an important part of holiness is actually embracing what we will do. How will I live? What must I do? What obedient acts are required of me? How must I live? How must I pray? How must I care? So the manner of our lives matters as well. And that will help us when we understand these examples here. That really what Jesus is talking about he's saying it's not about the abstinence, I won't, but about how you will live. It's about embracing this greater righteousness, embracing love-filled obedience. Now, I used to be a school teacher, and one of the ongoing challenges always for school teachers is what they call classroom management. What they mean by that is, how do you make the naughty boys be quiet and pay attention? All right. So we'd have big discussions about this, and at our fortnightly staff meetings, we'd talk about this. And I remember at one stage we were talking about, could we come up with some rules that would be right across the whole school, so that in every classroom, all our interactions with students, that they would actually kind of be a universal principles of our school. And we actually came up with 3, and they're all built around the one word of respect. And they were something like, I don't remember because it was a long time ago, but it was something like respect your teachers, respect other students, and respect others' right to learn. All right, so they're just foundational principles, right? They weren't an exhaustive list of what you could and couldn't do, because that would be very long. You know, don't pinch the kid next to you, don't take their stuff, don't pull hair, don't. Right? You know, you kind of have those, but they all come from these fundamental principles, all right? It's about respecting your teacher. It's about respecting others' right to learn. Do you get the idea? All right? So that's what Jesus is talking about here in the Sermon on the Mount, about these fundamental first principles. And they matter. The reading that Ken brought to us tells us that Jesus says this matters. What I'm about to tell you matters. He says, this is how you're meant to understand the law. He said, I'm not coming to change the law, to do away with it. What you need to understand is how it's really meant to operate. And it's not a more comprehensive rule. Jesus isn't adding to the lists of do's and don'ts. But he gives us examples of how we live out this greater righteousness of the kingdom. And Jesus took his own words very seriously. So in verse 18, there's this kind of signature thing that he says, for truly I tell you, verily, that was the word we had in the King James Version. Verily, truly, amen, I tell you. All right? I'm about to say something really important here. And we also know that what he was telling us was the final word. If you were to jump right to the end of the Sermon on the Mount and were to look at the story that we all know well, the example that Jesus uses, about the wise man builds his house upon the rock. And you probably all know that. You probably all learnt the chorus, didn't you? The wise man builds his house upon the rock. The rain came down and the floods came up. Okay, you know that one. What it's talking about, Jesus is saying, you must build your lives on my word. You must build your lives on my teaching. Sometimes we understand that to mean God will be with us when difficult times come, but it's actually more than that. Jesus says, these are my words. Build your lives on my words. And people are amazed at his teaching, amazed at the authority with which he spoke. So Jesus is saying this teaching, this word of mine, fulfills and transcends the law. It's not an addition to, it's not a replacement of, but this is how you live it out. And there's also another clue later in this gospel where Jesus says something about the law. Somebody comes to him and says, which is the greatest commandment? And he says, well, the greatest commandments are these. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbour as yourself. And can you see that they're first principles? All right, that's not an exhaustive list of the law, which is what somebody was trying to nail down from him. These are the first principles that underpin the law here. So it's about love and obedience rather than literal observance. And we should know that. I think we do know that. But sometimes it's just hard to live it out. And sometimes for a movement like ours, like the Salvation Army, we became very focused on the don'ts. We became very focused on abstinence instead of focusing on how do we live it out, the positive aspects, live out these first principles. So we became fixated on abstinence rather than holding ourselves to higher standards of love and kindness and generosity and patience and goodness. So we're going to look at the first 3 little sections of the Sermon on the Mount. And so today we're going to look at murder, adultery and divorce. All right, 3 cheery topics for a Sunday morning. All right, murder, adultery and divorce. And what's Jesus saying about those things? And what does that mean in terms of this idea of the first principles and the greater righteousness? What does it mean if he's talking about a kind of radical ethic? And what we'll find, and Sharon and I are going away for a couple of weeks holiday, but when I'm back, we're going to pick up the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to look at the next 3 examples after that, and then spend some more time in the Sermon on the Mount. And so Jesus gives 6 concrete examples. These are illustrations of these first principles that he's talking about. So it's not the exhaustive list, remember. And the first one comes in chapter 5 and verse 21. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you," now right, that's all of these little examples Jesus says that. "You have heard it said, but I say." You have heard it said, but I say. This is the final word, right? Verse 22, "But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." Now, I have to tell you, that worried me a time or two when I was a younger person. There have been occasions when I've called people fools. All right? I'm not sure if it's ever happened to you, but I might have said that. Of course, this can be a challenge in a culture like ours in Australia, which is built around humour. For instance, one of the ways that we express that we like people is we have a go at them. You know, don't we? Kind of friendly banter. You know, we say in a friendly and encouraging way, "You're an idiot." I guess there is a line there that we need to draw, and sometimes we don't understand it. I remember when I was teaching English conversation classes to a group of Japanese ladies, and one of them said to me that she didn't understand what had happened. She'd been in a bakery, and an Australian man had gone up to the person at the counter and said, "Gee, that cake there looks a bit ordinary. I better help you and get it off your hands. I'll buy it." And she said, "Why would that person be so rude to tell them that it's actually an awful looking cake?" And I said, "Well, they didn't mean that. They actually meant the opposite. They actually meant it's a great looking cake and I'm going to buy it." It was an Australian humour, and she just looked at me blankly, and I said, "It's the vibe, it's the marbo, it's the..." Sometimes humour is untranslatable. But part of Australian culture is to have a go at people, you know, in a friendly way, to say you're a fool, to say you're an idiot. But there is a line that we cross sometimes, and I don't know if you are like me, at times have been the butt of people's jokes. And we know that humour, even if it's supposedly in humour, can hurt us deeply, can't it? When people mock us. So there is something here about the way we see people, about the way we treat them, about the way we interact with them. And Jesus goes on to say this matters a lot. So he says, "Therefore, if you are offering a gift at the altar," that is, if you're coming to worship, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift." That reconciliation, being at peace with other people, matters more than worship. In fact, you can't worship truly. You can't worship truly where there is no reconciliation. How do I worship if I know that someone in the congregation despises me? How do I worship if I despise someone in the congregation? Reconciling hurts, takes precedence over worship. And in fact, Jesus says is the prerequisite for true worship. Reconciliation is urgent, really urgent. It's about the way we look at people. It's about the way we see them. It's not about making a list of the names that you can and can't call people. I can't call you a fool, but I can call you a dill. All right? That's acceptable. It's not about that. It's about this first principle here, about how we see people, about how we respond to them. And we get more of a clue in this next one, really. Verse 27, right? Adultery. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away." Here again, as a teenager, I read this verse and I was a little bit worried. I have to confess publicly before you that on occasions I've looked at pretty girls. All right? I read this and, came up at lots of youth group, camps and stuff. What does it mean? What does it mean? Well, it means something deeper than a teaching about whether Christian guys can look twice at pretty strangers, because that was the way it was always explained to me, right? You can look once, but if you look back for a second time, that's a sin. Which wasn't Jesus' point here, really. It's about something much more unwholesome. It's about something deeper than that. It's about the deliberate harbouring of desire for an illicit relationship. The deliberate harbouring of desire for an illicit relationship. Because when that happens, to use the phrase from Genesis, sin is crouching at your door. Sin is crouching at your door. Now, some of you may have caught up with the fact that in recent months, one of the great Christian leaders in the church, a guy called Bill Hybels, has had to resign, and after he's resigned, it's come out that there's been all sorts of inappropriate interactions and relationships with women. And the church continues to look into these, but there's a lot of women who have come forward to talk about this. So at some level, this is true, right? And you think, how does this happen? How does a man of God, a leader in the church, how does this happen to him? Well, it's this thing, all right? It's this deliberate harbouring of desire. Deliberate harbouring of desire. Because if it can happen to Bill Hybels, it can happen to you and it can happen to me. And Jesus says this matters so much. This matters so much that if it's your eye that causes you to stumble, gouge it out. All right? Get rid of your eye. Now, most people have regarded this as a metaphor. All right? Otherwise, there'd be a lot of one-eyed teenage guys walking around, right? So it's a metaphor for what we're meant to do here. There was a very famous Christian who took it literally, a guy called Origen, and was so worried about looking lustfully on women that he actually emasculated himself. So church history tells us. But most of us don't need to go that far. It's actually talking about a life surgery, about reordering our lives, about not going to the places where sin is crouching at our door. It might be about not going to certain activities, looking at certain things, certain behaviours. It's about, because what happens, see, relationships are unhealthy if there are undercurrents of desire there, often hidden sometimes from the object of the desire. But that's not a healthy way to live. It's not a good way to live. And in fact, it's even deeper than that, because what we're talking about here is the objectification of people. See, what matters most is that we truly encounter others and that we respond to them as I and you. But when we objectify people, we see them in the third person. We see them as it, he, she, it. Right, just some more grammar. You remember the first, second, third person, all right? So we see them as its, and they're people to be used or people who can benefit us. And so we might use people to work. We don't like them, but we pretend to like them because they can help get us a promotion. All right? Or this person can actually satisfy some need of ours in another way. So we pretend when they're with them. But we're called as Christians to be transparent in our love for others, in our actions towards others. See, love, true love, this authentic doctrine of love that Jesus is talking about is never predatory. There's never hidden undercurrents of desire. It never objectifies people. And the church, above all, must model this in the way we live. And this leads into the third example here, which is about divorce. Jesus says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now that's a great translation from the NIV, right? That's not always how those verses have been translated. That's a great translation. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. You have to remember the context here. Right? This is the first century. So marriages were arranged. They were contracts between families, often with dowries and all sorts of things attached. And a woman was part of that contractual arrangement to another family. You know, going out on dates for 6 and 12 months to decide if you loved someone, that was just not even on the table, all right? Not even thought of. Nobody had invented that yet. It's not that people didn't fall in love. I'm sure they did. But that's not the way marriages worked, right? We have to also remember that this was a patriarchal culture where the men are in control. So Jesus' message here is to the men. Jesus is speaking to the men because it was the men who had power in these relationships. It was the men who would write this certificate of divorce towards their wife. And what had happened is that divorce had become easy, and it was therefore hurtful, and it was damaging people, and it was damaging their society. So there were two schools of rabbis. One was the Shammai school, who followed Rabbi Shammai, and he had very strict rules around divorce. Very strict rules. He said, you don't get divorced. There was another rabbi, very influential rabbi, Rabbi Hillel, and he said that divorce is easy. If your wife displeases you, if she burns the cooking, that's enough. You can write her a note and you are divorced. I didn't say a word about that, Sharon. So divorce was relatively easy. So a husband wrote a note to his wife if she displeased him. Now remember, Jesus is giving us here not a new set of rules, but an illustration. Jesus says, divorcing your wife for no serious reason may be legal, but it is not right. Now Jesus is asked another question about divorce in this same gospel, or Matthew's gospel in 19, and he gives a longer answer to this, where people will come and ask him specifically about this topic. And when he replies, he says, if you divorce your wife not for adultery, and often that's translated as except, but the Greek word is not. If you divorce your wife not for adultery, you cause her to be in adultery. It's this idea that if you look at this as an illustration, if you divorce your wife for no good reason, if you divorce your wife for selfish gain, all right, you are damaging her and you are damaging society, potentially damaging your family. Because what we would say is that it is adultery that breaks the marriage covenant. Divorce formalises that. All right? The problem is with adultery. The problem is not with divorce. Adultery breaks the marriage covenant. Divorce formalises that. And there are other things that break the marriage covenant. There's domestic abuse. There's emotional and psychological abuse, physical abuse. All of those break the marriage covenant. Divorce formalises that. And also implied in this idea of unfaithfulness is an unfaithfulness that is not necessarily about sex with another person. And the church has not really dealt with this well, it must be said. We've struggled with this notion of divorce. And some of that really came from the impact of a Catholic view of marriage, where marriage was a sacrament and therefore couldn't be broken. And so it's taken the church some time to work through this. And this tough literal interpretation around divorce has been awful, and it's hurt people horribly. In Matthew 19, Jesus says, divorce is not in God's will, all right? God's desire is that every married couple love each other to the end of their days. That's God's desire. In the same way that God's desire is you and I should be holy. We should be as holy as possible for all of our lives. but we are not. But we are not. Divorce is a reality in a fallen world. And Jesus says, focus on the reasons behind that. What are the reasons underneath that? And he calls the men in his culture to commit themselves to loving, faithful marriage. That Jesus' message here is that faithfulness matters. That love in marriage matters. You see, what Jesus is saying is that to make divorce easy, which some of the rabbis have done, to make divorce easy is to make marriage cheap. And we wouldn't want that. We regard marriages as an important, a fundamental relationship in our culture, in our society, in the Christian church. But we accept that divorce is a reality, and sometimes it is the only good option. Sometimes divorce is the only good option. Divorce can be good. It can be a good. Was it ever God's ideal plan? No. But divorce can be a good. We know this, right? We're all touched by people in our lives who've been divorced. Okay? We all have friends and family, people we care about deeply, who've been through divorce. We would never make divorce easy. We'd never make marriage cheap. But we recognise that divorce can be a good. But we would never take it lightly. Because what Jesus is saying here, this is an illustration that you are called to live faithful, loving, generous lives certainly towards those who you are most close to, the people in your life. See, Jesus is saying that a true discipleship is about this radical, love-filled righteousness, a deeper Christian ethic. And in a way, these three stories are about love. Love is not hostile. We don't call people fools. Love is not predatory. We don't objectify people with illicit desire. Love matters in marriage. We're called to be loving husbands. We're called to be loving wives. That matters. It's important that we get it right. These three stories call us to this higher ethic, this greater righteousness of the kingdom that matters so much to the people of God. True discipleship is radical, love-filled righteousness. So there's something deep at play in these three stories here. This idea that we're called to live another way. And I guess we would say, well, what is my response to this? We would ask ourselves, have I called my brother a fool? Have I been as loving and generous as I should have been? So we might ask, who can help me? Well, thanks be to God, as Christians, we're not on our own in this enterprise. This isn't a rule book that Jesus gives us and says, do your best. The Holy Spirit is with us, helping us. The Spirit of Christ lives in us. Jesus himself models the greater righteousness and says, come walk with me and I will walk with you. Paul says in Romans 7 and 8, when he's wrestling with this whole notion of sin, he says, thanks be to God, the Spirit of God lives in you and me. So what is our adverbial phrase of manner? How do we describe our lives? Can we say, I obey Christ by never committing any big sins? Which is okay, that's a good start. Or can we say, I obey Christ through radical love-filled righteousness, through a life of generosity and goodness, enabled by the Holy Spirit at work within me? God is with us on this enterprise of being his people. We do not do this alone. True discipleship is radical, love-filled righteousness.